Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark Magnac and my co-host Robert Brantow are joined today by Harold Calla, Executive Chair of the First Nations Financial Management Board. With an impressive background in international business, he discusses how FMB works to strengthen the financial capacity of First Nations, helping them navigate the complexities of capital markets and secure the funding necessary to advance their economic goals.
Harold Calla, the Executive Director of the First Nations Financial Management Board, welcome to the Drumbeats podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Welcome, Harold. Great to have you with us today.
Thanks for taking time, Harold. I'd like to start by asking you a bit about your personal background, where you're from, and how you ended up where you are today.
Well, I've asked myself that question, how I ended up here. I'm a member of the Squamish First Nation in Vancouver, British Columbia, and in around Vancouver, British Columbia. I'm a FCPA, an accountant, and I grew up in a family business, and my father suggested that I stop pouring concrete, which is what our business was in, and go and do something more meaningful. He felt it was more meaningful, and I became an accountant in 1977. I spent most of my career in accounting working in the private sector with various companies as CFOs, and came back to my community to work at their request in 1987 to begin to deal with the emerging economy that the Squamish Nation was building in downtown Vancouver. I did everything at the Squamish Nation except social services, I think. I started out as CFO. I moved to Nec Dev, into treaty negotiations, and to, I think, looking at opportunities. It became very apparent that we could not achieve success until we were able to move out of some sections of the Indian Act. And that began a process of 20 years and 4 different pieces of legislation that allows First Nations on an optional basis to opt into alternatives to the Indian Act, mainly in the areas of lands and resources and economic development. And that's what I was sent away by my Squamish Council at the time that I was there to help create. The main one, of course, that we're talking about today is the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. That helped create the First Nations Financial Management Board, the First Nations Finance Authority, and the First Nation Tax Commission. And these were areas that Squamish, as well as a number of other First Nations in the country, felt we needed to have some changes in the relationship with Canada around so that we could better engage in economic development on our own terms. The Financial Management Board built administrative and financial capacity in First Nation communities that they might not otherwise have. The First Nation Tax Commission supports First Nation and the exercise of fiscal powers that were gained through the legislation. And the First Nation Finance Authority emulates the BC Municipal Finance Authority in a pooled borrowing environment that allows for First Nations anywhere in Canada to access debenture financing through the Finance Authority on rates and terms similar to the province of Ontario. It's a real achievement. We now have, of the 579 Indian Act bands, we have over 380 who have opted into this legislation. They are collecting over $100 million a year now in revenues, and the Finance Authority, on request from First Nations, have accessed $3 billion, in excess of $3 billion in debt financing for them to meet their needs. So it's been a journey as we move towards gaining recognition of our inherent right to self-government in many different ways. But we very quickly realized that we needed to be able to demonstrate accountability and transparency, and we need to build capacity in First Nation communities, many of whom would only be familiar with the responsibilities related to monitoring the contribution agreements that they would receive from the federal government to deliver programs and services. Obviously, things have moved much beyond that now, moved into the mainstream of the economy. And we now need to be in a position where we can bridge almost 200 years of exclusion by bringing awareness and capacity to First Nations so they can sit across the table as legitimate and equal partners with those they want to deal with.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and that's quite a triumvirate of organizations that spawned out of the fiscal management.
Yes, we have the major one that we're proud of is the First Nation Major Projects Coalition, because what was happening in British Columbia in the late around 2008 to 2012 is there was a lot of talk of natural resource development, and the requirements for consultation and accommodation that came from the Supreme Court of Canada saw referral letters going to many First Nations who did not have the confidence, the exposure, the experience to deal with multi-billion-dollar projects. And we needed to create critical mass and an ability to provide the administrative support that those groups needed to make free, prior, and informed consent decisions. And I think it's been invaluable. There are now over 180 communities across the country, mainly in the northern resource-rich areas, who are participating in securing that kind of support.
And just with a lot of these organizations and communities you've talked about, BC, I think the reason there's so much of this going on in BC is because most of the land is not covered by a treaty. Is that correct?
That's true. That's very true. But so, we were kind of on the leading edge of this. But I think that it's not the impact of Indigenous rights and title are not restricted to those who have or don't have treaties. Those who have treaties still are required to be consulted and accommodated. And it's more where we start from in terms of what the legal arguments might be. But I think Canada has recognized the duty is there to respond to the duty to consult and accommodate according to the UN Declaration, the UNDRIPA action plan by Canada itself. And it's really producing results as a result of the activities that have taken place over the last 2 or 3 years. I know that on one of my first trips to London was with Minister Wilkinson to speak to the capital markets about investing in Canada. And so the pace has really picked up in this country. The federal government has responded in ways that Minister Wilkins said they would, and that in one of the recent budgets, they provided for a $5 billion loan guarantee to support Indigenous participation in major resource developments. So it's a very quickly moving target, and particularly now that there's a significant focus on how we should respond to the election of Mr. Trump in the United States and all of the activities that are related to that.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll get on to that. And if I'm simplifying, FMB would help prepare First Nations for the fiscal responsibilities that come with borrowing money, investing, taking equity stakes, managing money. The financial authority would assist in raising the funds necessary to deliver projects and other transactions. And the Major Projects Coalition would assist in actually moving projects from start to completion.
Yeah, you've nailed it. I think one of the things that it was important to understand, particularly in the early years, if you have no experience or exposure to the kinds of economic activities that are now present, and you've only dealt with the management of program funding, it's very intimidating to be thrust into the limelight of trying to consider the implications of investing in a $40 or $50 billion project, as these First Nations were in 2008 to 2012. And the outcome of that was fear and apprehension, and an unwillingness to make a mistake caused there to be a pause in any kind of activity that was contemplated. And as a result of that, the natural gas activities that were contemplated during that period, which the then premier indicated were worth $40 billion, passed us by. First Nations weren't actively involved in a way that saw final investment decisions made on many of these projects. They're starting to now, But I think what we're seeing now is a recognition on the part of everybody that First Nation participation in the assessment and approval processes is important, and ensuring that the economic benefits packages that is negotiated is reflected in those agreements. And that is, I think, our greatest hope at the moment, is to expedite those processes so that the other regulatory processes that seem to be an impediment to getting to final investment decisions are being refined in this country.
Absolutely. There is a recognition, I think, amongst business and government now that if you're going to get projects or other transactions completed, you're going to have to involve in a meaningful way Indigenous First Nations communities. No better way to demonstrate proper consultation than to have a First Nation take an equity stake in a project and be a real partner with risk and responsibilities and a seat at the board table. You've been around FMB since its inception. Can you give us some examples of the success stories or some of the files that you're most proud of?
Well, I think what we're most proud of is the fact that we are being successful in achieving some confidence in First Nation communities in themselves by virtue of them having a better understanding of how to engage, how to measure risk, and to how to negotiate and participate in discussions with the private sector. The big successes, of course, that have been profiled are the Clearwater transaction that the Big Maw Nations in Atlantic Canada undertook to reach an agreement to have a 50% interest in a $1 billion company called Clearwater Seafoods. That has led to this group acquiring the largest shipyards in Atlantic Canada to be able to look at being part of their own economic activity and fleet renewal. So I think those are tremendous successes that show that when you have access to capital at reasonable rates and terms, and it just snowballs. One thing leads to another. You start to achieve economies of scale, and that moves forward. So I think that's been a tremendous success. The province of Ontario, in looking at transmission lines, engaged in a partnership with First Nations. That's been another tremendous success in terms of both provincial and federal governments getting on side and recognizing the opportunity there and getting First Nations to appreciate that they can achieve some of their objectives through these kinds of partnerships. That's another tremendous success. The Haisla First Nation and the Cedar LNG project is another huge success, where now the First Nation itself will own the largest natural gas plant, production plant in the world, quite frankly, at the moment. And again, through their chief just acknowledged at a AFN meeting in Vancouver that without the First Nation Fiscal Management Act institutions, they might not have been down this path and able to do what they've done. So those are really significant successes in terms of what we've achieved. But there are, communities like Fisher River Cree Nation in Manitoba that have developed kind of like a microeconomy within their own region. So they now have invested in the development of the infrastructure and businesses to provide materials and supplies to the region as a result of gaining some confidence and moving into business. I think more importantly, communities are now recognizing that there are rights and obligations to the government of Canada that eventually they'll come to terms with. But in the meantime, they have needs in their community, and they need to be in a position where economic opportunity doesn't pass them by, that they are engaging and developing in those things. So it's not just at the macro level, it's also at the micro level that we're having a tremendous impact. And as you all well know, our economies generally are resourced by the many micro kinds of activities that are involved. And I think this is helping First Nations become more self-reliant, develop employment, and reduce the impacts and the costs of poverty.
Maybe we can talk about some specific initiatives. I know the FMB commented on the BC government's action plan for the province. You advocated for a stronger connection between social and economic aspects of the plan to empower First Nations in their pursuit of self-governance?
Yeah, I think, often policy statements are made and initiatives are undertaken. And then we think that we're done. We don't measure the success, failure, or the impacts of these kinds of initiatives. And I think many of the efforts around UNDRIP and in particular BC's action plan, in our view, did not provide a meaningful insight into the success and impacts that their policies were going to have on Indigenous people, or laying out the requirements. I was at an event last Friday when the Premier released to the Vancouver Board of Trade comments regarding the budget that they had just released. And one of the interesting comments that he made regarding their desire to see an expansion of LNG sales abroad was that they were not abandoning the principle of Indigenous economic inclusion and equity. And I think that was a very significant move forward by the provincial government to continue to respect that the action plan does require things to be actually visible and done on the ground. And I think that was the concern that we had. We also looked to the opportunity for better inclusion, of First Nation peoples in the various sectors within government and within the private sector itself. We don't have the opportunity to spend 200 years to evolve. Canada and the world needs us to step forward in a much more quick fashion. And in order to do that, we need to benefit from the exposure and experience that is elsewhere. And we need to be brought in, and we need to be a part of the processes that are being followed elsewhere, and to be in a position where we can bring that experience and exposure back to our communities to facilitate our communities dealing with the matters that there are before them around economic development.
So, Harold, I think that's such a critical statement you need, that Canada and the world can't wait.
Yes.
Right. And I think all this is coming together with the First Nations authorities that were set up a number of years ago, because now we're in a completely changed environment in Canada. And for the first time in 200 years, the Indigenous people have a leadership role to play in shaping the country that we all live in together now, Canada. Whereas if this crisis had happened 50 years ago, there wouldn't be that voice, and we wouldn't move the country forward in a way that benefits all the people who live there. And of course, the Indigenous people have been there for millennia. So I think that's important, and is a differentiator for Canada about who we are as a people and as a nation.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I was fortunate enough to be invited by the government of Canada to sit on the board of the first of Trans Mountain and the pipeline expansion. That initiative got mired in almost a couple of decades of approval processes. And it wasn't until that there was an enlightened attitude by the Trans Mountain Corporation itself that it needed to get First Nation consideration and approvals to the extent that it can or could. And as a result, they went out and got almost 60 communities along the pipeline route to be part of an initiative to help build the pipeline. It resulted in almost $6.5 billion worth of projects being during the construction period being provided to First Nation companies or joint ventures. 11% of the workforce was Indigenous, that peaked at 7,700 people. There was about $600 million in impact benefit agreements. And now we're starting to talk about an equity position in First Nations. And I think that as Canada, in the face of the current circumstances, is now starting to talk about more pipelines and more capacity to export its fossil fuel resources, this is a model that I think will facilitate the kind of conversations that need to take place that will expedite the approval processes. There's a lot more involved in reforming the regulatory process than just the Indigenous issues, for sure. But I think having the Indigenous issues on side and supportive will help facilitate those regulatory processes. I think I'm also observing that there is an interest in the international capital markets to see that countries like Canada who adopt a plan to implement UNDRIP to measure how they're doing, how they're moving towards net zero. And I think, again, engaging with First Nations is a way in which these activities can be seen by the investment community as viable.
Harold, our international listeners might be interested in the status of any potential sale of the Trans Mountain pipeline. What can you tell us about?
Well, I can tell you that the government maintains its interest to return the company to the private sector. I think it is prudently doing so in a way that the value that has been created is realized in the sale. So there's no change in that perspective, I guess, and that's been made clear. We're at a point in time where the project commenced operations in December. Many of those around who have been involved in these kinds of initiatives and startups were absolutely amazed at how flawless the startup of this operation was, and it's achieving great success. You know, the turmoil that is in place at the moment around the world on many different fronts is, I think, putting pressure on the creation of external markets. And as users of fossil fuels and other energy sources are starting to scramble to find alternatives, I would like to say that, you know, where people wondered if and why the Trans Mountain pipeline was being built, that is no longer a question, given events of the last couple of months. So, and the question is, how do we look at expanding the ability to access the international markets? We can get to Asia from the West Coast, but get to India and Pakistan, we need to go to the East Coast. So those kinds of conversations, I'm sure, are going to take place over the next little while. So I think there's going to be tremendous investment opportunities in Canada over the next 5 to 10 years in some of these major initiatives.
Are you noticing a different approach from your members of the FMB because of the turmoil the last couple of months?
Absolutely. I had the pleasure of presenting at the Assembly of First Nations meeting in Vancouver. And the Assembly of First Nations is a national political body of First Nations. And they had an UNDRIP session where they talked about UNDRIP and the implementation, and couldn't help but talk about the effects of Trump. And FMB hosted a side event talking about UNDRIP and economic reconciliation. There was standing room only in the event. And we had Crystal Smith from Heisla stand up and give a testimonial about how the Cedar LNG project benefited from the support of the FMA institutions. You can't ask for a better PR initiative than that. And I think you're going to be hearing from Member 2 in London regarding the work that was done but with the financial institutions in their acquisition of Clearwater Seafood. So I think there's an interest. I think there's an apprehension in the First Nation communities about any potential that there being the influence of others to create a 51st state in Canada. Our whole system is based upon the historical creation of this federation, and Indigenous relationships would have to take a 180, and who knows where they'll end up. I can't believe there's any desire on the part of First Nation communities to see the Indigenous file handed over to Washington, D.C. I was at a an event for the Aboriginal Financial Officers Association in Halifax in the last month. And the chief of RAMA came up and talked to me and said he had just come home from the States and he was playing golf. And the people he was golfing with asked what he thought of Mr. Trump's suggestion. And he said, I had to think for a minute. And he said, well, I'll tell you this. They stole my land once. I haven't dealt with them yet. So let's wait for that to get resolved before we have to deal with Mr. Trump.
Chief Ted Williams.
Yes.
Yes. We had Chief Ted Williams on a podcast recently, as we did Chief Crystal Smith. So all these names and individuals you talk about, I mean, this is really how it's working in Canada today. But you've mentioned in the past that you've, of course, been exposed and worked with the international capital markets. What is the perception of Canada when you're talking to them, and the additional perception of the role of Indigenous peoples now, of those conversations?
Well, I think there's not a good comprehension about the legal framework that exists in Canada. And, not to go in a protracted history lesson, but you have to go back to the Royal Proclamation, of 1763. And that lays out some of the concepts that preserve the existence of Aboriginal rights and title and the need to engage with them. So not many in the international community understand that. And many of the regions where we have relationships with Indigenous communities in places like Australia, New Zealand, Finland, and even the United States don't understand the legal basis for the requirement to engage with Indigenous people. They also haven't understood how we were marginalized historically and why we find ourselves in a position of extreme poverty, of no significant economic development opportunity or emerging economic development opportunity. Within Canada, I consider First Nations are emerging third world economies. That may sound strange to some, but that's in fact what we are. And I think once people realize that, and they realize that the governments have moved to take some action, the creation of the legislative frameworks that I've spoken of have been major steps forward. The ceding of some fiscal room has been a major step forward in the exercise of self-government. More conversations are taking place within Canada on that. I think that the international community is pleased to see the government is stepping in and not expecting the private sector to pay for the price for non-Indigenous inclusion in the economy, that the government of Canada will step up and do that, and that it should not be an added burden to the cost of developing a project or the returns on the project. What they have to be willing with is to share in that. And, it's the same old story. Do you want 100% of nothing or a percentage of something? And I think what we're looking at here is a percentage of something that's reflective of the contributions that each are making to the creation of these opportunities. It's no secret that strategic metals are very much in the forefront of these conversations around the world, quite frankly. I mean, for those of us who are here in Canada, you look at what Trump is saying about Greenland, about Iceland, about the Arctic, and about Canada. It's all about getting access to the resources. And I think that people are now recognizing that in order to quickly get access to those resources so we can develop independent supply and have more secure economies, that we need to include Indigenous people, and we need to do it in a timely way. We can't find ourselves going back to the courts, to the Supreme Court of Canada, to try to make some of these decisions. It is high time for there to be leadership, political leadership, that recognizes these things and embraces the concepts that are being put forward for inclusion and meaningful economic participation. I think if we do those things, and the international community sees that there is a much clearer path to a final investment decision, they will welcome the opportunity to invest in Canada.
Thank you. really well articulated for our listeners, particularly here in the city. But in terms of, I think this is my perspective. I think now that Canada's addressing these issues, it actually puts us ahead of other places that haven't resolved these Indigenous issues, that don't have some of those underlying treaties. Whereas at the moment it might seem, oh, well, it's easy to get things done there, but there will be a price to pay that gets bigger every day that it's not done. And I think your comment about, underdeveloped communities in Canada, that holds the whole country back, right? Rather there is, we understand why, but by addressing them, as you said, that uplifts the whole country. And that just feeds growth across all of Canada for everyone.
Well, I've just reviewed an op-ed piece that's going to be released soon about Canada's sovereignty and the impact of the Indigenous economy, how intertwined those are. I think that it's absolutely essential that Canadians understand that Indigenous economic development is in all Canadians' interests. It's in the world's interest that Canada is able to bring to like-minded First Nations the resources that Canada has to offer to stabilize those economies. We're part of a solution. We're not part of a problem. And I think that the more people begin to appreciate that there are pathways to achieve those outcomes, the more comfortable they are in that kind of notion. We complain a lot about Canada sometimes, but I tell you, I travel around the world and speak to Indigenous communities. And I come back to Canada appreciating how far we've come and how far Canada has come. I was just in Finland with Minister Haidu, meeting with the Finnish government and the Sami people. And they're now starting to look at what we do and how we do it. I'm going back to Australia for the fourth time in May, again to speak to their government officials about how you involve Indigenous people in the economy. Because what's happening throughout the world, Indigenous communities are beginning to migrate, if they're not already, into the cities. So you're dealing with the consequences of that and the challenges around poverty and other issues that creates. So we need to be in a position where we're starting to address those issues globally. And a lot of people are looking, a lot of countries, New Zealand, the United States, Australia, Finland, are looking at what Canada has done and how the First Nations in Canada have responded to the opportunities that are before them. When you go to a political meeting now in Canada, we're never abandoning Aboriginal rights and title. But often the topic about economic development is the first topic that's raised. We're tired of waiting for somebody to take care of us. We're prepared to take care of ourselves as long as we're given the tools that others are able to have. And as long as there isn't an expectation that we're all going to agree. I'm always humored by the fact that everybody wants unanimous consensus from the Indigenous community. And I've asked myself and parliamentary committees, quite frankly, why that expectation is put on us when you can't do that yourself. So there will be a majority kind of decision moving forward. We don't want to force the kind of things that we talk about on anybody. But what we see is those of us who are involved with the communities who are our clients, as they move through our processes, their well-being index improves, their own source revenue improves, the employment opportunities improve, everything gets better in those communities. And it's not just because of us, it's because of those communities having the confidence to make the decisions that they need to make. And sometimes those are hard decisions that they have to make. But they see a path forward and they see through the institutions the kind of technical support and administrative support that they need to be able to demonstrate that their goals and objectives are achievable.
Harold, you've seen the evolution in Canada and in Indigenous participation over the years. You've put in a lot of time. There are other things you could be doing at this stage of your career, but you keep going. What excites you? What's coming next that keeps you coming in to the office every day?
Well, I thought I was retiring in December. My governor and council appointment ended, but they seem to want me for another 3 years, and I accepted because I see opportunity. I said to them, I'm prepared to if we're doing something. If this is just managing the status quo, I'm gone. And so, what does that mean? That means we need, in this country, improved access to capital, improved capacity development funding into our First Nation communities, the development of additional institutions to be able to support the development of real self-government in this country, to be able to devolve the Department of Indigenous Services Canada into First Nation institutions and organizations. There is going to be a third order of government in this country, and people don't need to be afraid of it. It'll be more effective than the present system of delivery through a federal government transfer. We've seen examples of it through initiatives like the First Nation Health Authority in British Columbia. We've taken over all of that from the provincial government, funded by the federal government, and we're delivering better results and better outcomes as a result of it. We're able to have the flexibility in designing programs that meet our services and obligations. And so I think that's what excites me. From the Financial Management Board's perspective, you need to have the accountability and transparency, not only to those who provide revenues to First Nations, but to our citizens, that we have the ability to undertake these kinds of initiatives. And I think that's what excites me. More and more First Nations are understanding the value of good financial management and certification. We're starting to understand the implications of the economic activities that we're undertaking around the reporting in the band's financial statements about general government business enterprises and nonprofits. We're moving from a very rudimentary economic and financial system to one in the 21st century, and we're going to have to do it in less than 20 years. So old guys like me need to stay around and offer some thoughts.
I'm glad to hear that you are sticking around, Harold. And I want to, on behalf of all First Nations communities, want to thank you for your service over the years and the part that you've played in making some of those things that we've discussed come to fruition.
Well, a lot of people have contributed to that. We sometimes are seen as the figureheads, but it is the Crystal Smiths of the world. That's what brings me to work every day. It is seeing her success as an individual in gaining the confidence and the capacity to do what she's doing with the support of the institutions, and seeing the need for that. That was our dream when we started talking about creating these institutional frameworks in the late 1990s. I never thought I'd live to see the day, but I have, and it's just so rewarding to see. And the many people who have contributed to that. You know, people are looking for something in their work that they can feel good about, that they see progress being made. And I can say that the Fiscal Management Act institution attract a lot of professional Indigenous people to be in a position to be able to help communities. And it's the sharing of this knowledge and this capacity throughout the country that these institutions create the opportunity for, that is also so very rewarding to those communities and to our employees. You know, we've been up to a community called Ottawapiskat and the James Bay that has been in the news nationally and internationally with communities living in desperate poverty. And we've created opportunities for them and supported them by being present and developing systems that now permits them to borrow from the First Nation Finance Authority as an example to do things. We're moving forward with initiatives like the monetization of federal capital transfers to allow for the $500 million in infrastructure that they need to be secured through a 10-year grant and then taken to the First Nation Finance Authority and monetized through that so that you can build it sooner and not let inflation take half of the value that you can create. It's those kind of initiatives that I think are in the forefront that interest not only First Nations in Canada, governments in Canada, and the political parties in Canada, but around the world. You know, For us, we've always maintained that Indigenous issues should not be partisan issues. This is an issue that Canada and the Crown has a responsibility to undertake, and we're there to help them undertake that.
Yes. And Harold, just hearing you speak as a non-Indigenous person, these are great Canadian stories, and yourself and others you've mentioned are great Canadian heroes because they're just making Canada a better place to live. And anybody who would hear their leaders talk about doing that in their community, that's what everybody wants. So
I will tell you that I've offered to certify the federal government, but I haven't been
there's a lot of people who want that. That's for sure. That's for sure. But that is absolutely fantastic, Rob.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to welcoming you to London.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to coming again. I think the free world outside of the United States is in the midst of creating a new order. And London's going to be a key factor in how that gets created. And I think what I want everyone in London to understand is Canada is going to be a safe place to do business. It's going to be a safe place to invest. It's going to be a safe place to source your supply chain needs into the future. And we look forward to that working relationship.
Well said. And thanks again for your time, Harold.
Okay.
Niawan.
Now, take care.
Wonderful to have you with us, Harold, and look forward to seeing you.
My pleasure, and thank you for your kind words. But, there are hundreds, if not thousands of people, leaders in communities who have got us to this point. Some of us just happen to be the spokespeople for all of those hardworking people.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you to Harold Calla for sharing his insights with us. And thank you for viewing and listening. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Mark your calendars for the upcoming 2025 summit taking place on the 10th of April. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.